The Bourbon Restoration was the period of French history following the fall of Napoleon in 1814 until the July Revolution of 1830. The brothers of executed Louis XVI of France reigned in highly conservative fashion, and the exiles returned. They were nonetheless unable to reverse most of the changes made by the French Revolution and Napoleon. At the Congress of Vienna they were treated respectfully, but had to give up all the territorial gains made since 1789. King Louis XVI of the House of Bourbon had been overthrown and executed during the French Revolution, which in turn was followed by Napoleon as ruler of France. A coalition of European powers defeated Napoleon in the War of the Sixth Coalition, ended the First Empire in 1814, and restored the monarchy to the brothers of Louis XVI. The Bourbon Restoration lasted from the 6th of April 1814 until the popular uprisings of the July Revolution of 1830. There was an interlude in spring 1815, the 100 Days, when the return of Napoleon forced the Bourbons to flee France. When Napoleon was again defeated, they returned to power in July. During the Restoration, the new Bourbon regime was a constitutional monarchy, unlike the absolutist ancient regime, and so it had some limits on its power. The period was characterized by a sharp conservative reaction and consequent minor but consistent occurrences of civil unrest and disturbances. It also saw the re-establishment of the Catholic Church as a major power in French politics. Permanent changes in French society. The eras of the French Revolution and Napoleon brought a series of major changes to France which the Bourbon Restoration did not reverse. First of all, France became highly centralized, with all decisions made in Paris. The political geography was completely reorganized and made uniform. France was divided into 80+ departments, which have endured into the 21st century. Each department had an identical administrative structure and was tightly controlled by a prefect appointed by Paris. The complex multiple overlapping legal jurisdictions of the old regime had all been abolished, and there was now one standardized legal code, administered by judges appointed by Paris, and supported by police under national control. The Catholic Church lost all its lands and buildings during the Revolution, and these were sold off or came under the control of local governments. The bishop still ruled his diocese, and communicated with the Pope through the government in Paris. Bishops, priests, nuns and other religious people were paid salaries by the state. All the old religious rites and ceremonies were retained, and the government maintained the religious buildings. The church was allowed to operate its own seminaries and to some extent local schools as well, although this became a central political issue into the 20th century. Bishops were much less powerful than before, and had no political voice. However, the Catholic Church reinvented itself and put a new emphasis on personal religiosity that gave it a hold on the psychology of the faithful. Education was centralized, with the Grand Master of the University of France controlling every element of the entire educational system from Paris. New technical universities were opened in Paris which to this day have a critical role in training the elite. The old aristocracy had returned, and recovered much of the land they owned directly. However, they completely lost all their old seigneurial rights to the rest of the farmland, and the peasants were no longer under the control. The old aristocracy had dallied with the ideas of the Enlightenment and rationalism. Now the aristocracy was much more conservative, and much more supportive of the Catholic Church. For the best jobs, meritocracy was the new policy, and aristocrats had to compete directly with the growing business and professional class. Anti-clerical sentiment became stronger than ever before, but was now based in certain elements of the middle class and indeed the peasantry as well. The great masses of the French people were peasants in the countryside, or impoverished workers in the cities. They gained new rights, and a new sense of possibilities. Although relieved of many of the old burdens, controls, and taxes, the peasantry was still highly traditional in its social and economic behavior. Many eagerly took on mortgages to buy as much land as possible for the children, so debt was an important factor in the calculations. The working class in the cities was a small element, and had been freed of many restrictions imposed by medieval guilds. However, France was very slow to industrialize, and much of the work remained drudgery without machinery or technology to help. France was still localized, especially in terms of language, but now there was an emerging French nationalism that showed its national pride in the army and foreign affairs. Political overview. In April 1814, the armies of the Sixth Coalition restored Louis XVIII of France to the throne. He was called the Bourbon Pretender by historiographers, especially by those unfavorable to the restoration of the monarchy. Her constitution, the Charter of 1814, was drafted. It presented all Frenchmen as equal before the law, but retained substantial prerogative for the king and nobility and limited voting to those paying at least 300 francs a year in direct taxes. Louis XVIII was the supreme head of the state. He commanded the land and sea forces, declared war, made treaties of peace, alliance and commerce, appointed to all places of public administration, and made the necessary regulations and ordinances for the execution of the laws and the security of the state. Louis was more liberal than his successor Charles X, choosing many centrist cabinets. Louis XVIII died in September 1824. He was succeeded by his brother, Charles. Charles X pursued a more conservative form of governance than Louis. His ultra-reactionary laws included the Anti-Sacrilege Act, which saw his popularity plummet. The king and his ministers attempted to manipulate the outcome of a general election in 1830 through the July ordinances. The ordinances sparked a revolution against Charles's coup attempt. By the 2nd of August 1830, Charles had fled Paris and abdicated in favor of his grandson Henry, Count of Chambord. Henry's theoretical reign was ended on the 9th of August when the Chamber of Deputies declared Louis Philippe d'Orléans, who was currently ruling France, as regent king of the French, thus ushering in the July monarchy. Louis XVIII, 1814–1824. First Restoration. Louis XVIII's restoration to the throne in 1814 was effected largely through the support of Napoleon's former foreign minister, Talleyrand, who convinced the victorious Allied powers of the desirability of a Bourbon restoration. The Allies had initially split on the best candidate for the throne. Britain favored the Bourbons. The Austrians considered a regency for Napoleon's son, François Bonaparte, and the Russians were open to either the Duc d'Orléans, Louis Philippe, or Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, Napoleon's former marshal, who was in line for the Swedish throne. Napoleon was offered to keep the throne in February 1814, on the condition that France returned to its 1792 frontiers, but he refused. The feasibility of the restoration was in doubt, but the allure of peace to a war-weary French public, and demonstrations of support for the Bourbons in Paris, Bordeaux, Marseille, and Lyons, helped reassure the Allies. Louis, in accordance with the Declaration of Saint-Ouen, granted a written constitution, the Charter of 1814, which guaranteed a bicameral legislature with a hereditary, appointive Chamber of Peers and an elected Chamber of Deputies. The the role was consultative, as only the king had the power to propose or sanction laws, and appoint or recall ministers. The franchise was limited to men with considerable property holdings, and just 1% of people could vote. Many of the legal, administrative, and economic reforms of the revolutionary period were left intact. The Napoleonic Code, which guaranteed legal equality and civil liberties, the peasants' Bayern's nation number, and the new system of dividing the country into departments were not undone by the new king. Relations between church and state remained regulated by the King Court of 1801. However, in spite of the fact that the charter was a condition of the Restoration, the preamble declared it to be a concession and grant, given by the free exercise of our royal authority. After a first sentimental flush of popularity, Louis's gestures towards reversing the results of the French Revolution quickly lost him support among the disenfranchised majority. Symbolic acts such as the replacement of the tricolour with the white flag, the titling of Louis as the 18th and as King of France rather than King of the French, and the monarchy's recognition of the anniversaries of the deaths of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were significant. A more tangible source of antagonism was the pressure applied to possessors of Bayern's nation by the Catholic Church and returning émigrés, attempting to repossess the former lands. Other groups bearing ill sentiment towards Louis included the army, non-Catholics, and workers hit by a post-war slump and British imports. The 100 Days Napoleon's emissaries informed him of this brewing discontent, and on the 20th of March 1815, he returned to Paris from Elba. On his route, Napoleon, most troops sent to stop his march, including some that were nominally royalist, felt more inclined to join the former emperor than to stop him. Louis was forced to flee Paris to Ghent on the 19th of March. He returned after Napoleon was defeated in the Battle of Waterloo and sent again into exile. In Louis's absence, a small revolt in the traditionally pro-royalist Vendée was put down, but there were otherwise few subversive acts favoring the Restoration, even though Napoleon's popularity began to flag. Second Restoration Talleyrand was again influential in seeing that the Bourbons reigned, as was Fouché, Napoleon's Minister of Police during the 100 Days. This Second Restoration saw the beginning of the Second White Terror, largely in the South, when supporters of the monarchy sought revenge against those who had supported Napoleon's return, killing 200 to 300 and forcing thousands to flee. The perpetrators were often known as the Verdes because of the green cockets, which was the color of the Comte d'Artois, this being the title of Charles X at the time, who was associated with the hardline ultra-royalists, or ultras. After a period in which local authorities were powerless to stop the violence, the king and his ministers sent out their own officials to restore order. A second Treaty of Paris was signed on the 20th of November 1815, which had more punitive terms than the first. France was ordered to pay 700 million francs in indemnities, and the country's borders were reduced to the 1790 level. After the Battle of Waterloo, France was occupied by 1.2 million foreign soldiers. Occupation continued until 1818, by around 200,000 soldiers under the command of the Duke of Wellington, and France was made to pay the costs of their accommodation and rations, on top of the reparations. The promise of tax cuts, prominent in 1814, failed to actualize because of these payments. The legacy of this, and the White Terror, left Louis with a formidable opposition. Louis's chief ministers were at first moderate, including Talleyrand, the Duc de Richelieu, and Elie. Duc d'Exiles. Louis himself followed a cautious policy. The Chamber Introuvable, elected in 1815 and given the nickname unobtainable by Louis due to the overwhelming ultra-royalist majority, threw out the Talleyrand-Fouché government and sought to legitimize the White Terror, passing trial against enemies of the state, sacking 50,000–80,000 civil service members, and dismissing 15,000 army officers. Richelieu, an émigré who had left in October 1789, who had had nothing at all to do with the new France, was appointed prime minister. The Chamber Introuvable, meanwhile, continued to aggressively uphold the place of the monarchy and the church, and called for more commemorations for historical royal figures. Over the course of the parliamentary term, the ultra-royalists increasingly began to fuse the brand of politics with state ceremony. Much to Louis' chagrin, d'Exiles, perhaps the most moderate minister, moved to stop the politicization of the National Guard by banning political demonstrations by the militia in July 1816. Owing to contrasting standpoints of the chamber and the king, the ultra-royalists began to assert the Chamber of Deputies' rights. This resulted in a concession from the government that the chamber had the right to approve state expenditure, granted after the ultra-royalists attempted to obstruct the 1816 budget. However, they were unable to gain a guarantee from the king that his cabinets would represent the majority in Parliament. In September 1816, the chamber was dissolved by Louis for its reactionary measures, and electoral manipulation resulted in a more liberal chamber in 1816. Richelieu served until the 29th of December 1818, followed by Jean-Joseph, Marquis d'Exiles until the 19th of November 1819, and then d'Exiles until the 20th of February 1820. This was the era in which the doctrines dominated policy. The following year, the government changed the electoral laws, resorting to gerrymandering, and altering the franchise to allow some rich men of trade and industry to vote, in an attempt to prevent the ultras from winning a majority in future elections. Press censorship was clarified and relaxed. Some positions in the military hierarchy were made open to competition, and mutual schools were set up that encroached on the Catholic monopoly of public primary education. D'Exiles purged a number of ultra-royalist prefects and sub-prefects, and in by-elections, an unusually high proportion of Bonapartists and Republicans were elected, some of whom were backed by ultras resorting to tactical voting. The ultras were strongly critical of the practice of giving civil service employment to promotions to deputies, as the government continued to consolidate its position. By 1820, the opposition liberals, who with the ultras made up half the chamber, proved unmanageable, and d'Exiles and the king were looking for ways to revise the electoral laws again, to ensure a more tractable conservative majority. The assassination of the Duc de Berry, the ultra-reactionary son of Louis' ultra-reactionary brother and heir presumptive, the future Charles X, by a Bonapartist in February 1820, triggered d'Exiles' fall from power and the triumph of the ultras. Richelieu returned to power for a short interval, from 1820 to 1821. The press was more strongly censored, detention without trial was reintroduced, and doctrinaire leaders, such as François Guizot, were banned from teaching at the École Normale Supérieure. Under Richelieu, the franchise was changed to give the wealthiest electors a double vote, in time for the November 1820 election. After a resounding victory, a new ultra-ministry was formed, headed by Jean-Baptiste de Villiers, a leading ultra who served for 6 years. The ultras found themselves back in power in favorable circumstances. Berry's wife, the Duchess de Berry, gave birth to a miracle child, child, Henry. 7 months after the Duke's death, Napoleon died on St. Helena in 1821, and his son, the Duc de Reichstadt, remained interned in Austrian hands. Literary figures, most notably Chateaubriand, but also Hugues, Lamartine, Vigny, and Nodier, rallied to the Ultras cause. Both Hugo and Lamartine later became Republicans, whilst Nodier was formally. Soon, however, Villiers proved himself to be nearly as cautious as his master, and, so long as Louis lived, overtly reactionary policies were kept to a minimum. The Ultras broadened the support, and put a stop to growing military dissent in 1823, when intervention in Spain, in favor of Spanish Bourbon King Ferdinand VII, and against the liberal Spanish government, fomented popular patriotic fervor. Despite British backing for the military action, the intervention was widely seen as an attempt to win back influence in Spain, which had been lost to the British under Napoleon. The French army, called the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, was led by the Duc d'Angoulême, the Comte d'Artois' son. The French troops marched to Madrid and then to Cadiz, ousting the liberals with little fighting, and would remain in Spain for 5 years. Support for the Ultras amongst the voting rich was further strengthened by doling out favours in a similar fashion to the 1816 Chamber, and fears over the Charbonnerie, the French equivalent of the Carbonari. In the 1824 election, another large majority was secured. Louis XVIII died on the 16th of September 1824, and was succeeded by his brother, the Comte d'Artois, who took the title of Charles X.